This interview is for the British Chinese Workforce Heritage Project. Today is the 14th of March 2014. My name is Rosa Krowska, and can I begin by asking your name?
Steve Munby, Councillor Steve Munby.
Great. And how long have you served in Liverpool Council?
I was elected for the first time in May 1998 for the old Abercrombie ward, so it's just coming up for 16 years. And the ward I represent has changed its boundaries, but it's always included the historical Chinatown area in Liverpool.
So what's the name of the ward currently?
It's currently Riverside Ward, and it's a Liverpool Riverside constituency, and it covers a part of the city centre, the historic Chinatown, and part of Liverpool 8, Toxteth, and basically goes south from the city centre along the waterfront.
And what does your role as a cabinet member for neighbourhood involve?
I've got quite a diverse portfolio. The core of it is what I'd call neighbourhoods, which is working with local councillors, our neighbourhood staff and local partners to solve problems at a very local level, at ward level. I also have responsibility for the youth service provision for young people. We've got quite a significant programme of funding community and voluntary sector organisations. I'm responsible for that. And also I've got a large chunk of our environmental portfolio, street cleaning, the bins, maintaining green spaces. So it's quite a dispersed range of responsibilities. But it's primarily, I suppose, about services that, you know, people use at a local level, that about quality of life, really. Keeps me busy.
And during this time, have you had a lot of interaction with the Chinese residents or Chinese organisations in Riverside?
Yeah, well, as I said earlier, Riverside Ward includes historic Chinatown, so I've always had quite a strong relationship with the local Chinese community, I hope. Historically, the majority of the Chinese community in Liverpool lived in that area. That's no longer the case, but it's still the focus for a lot of activity. Chinese restaurants, but also a lot of Chinese organisations. I hold a surgery once a month in the Pagoda community centre with Chinese-speaking interpreters. It's not particularly a local surgery. I mean, I do other local surgeries, but I have Chinese people coming from all over, in fact all over Merseyside, not just Liverpool, to see me, because it's a chance of a surgery with a counsellor with a Chinese interpreter. So that's mainly for people who have got very little English, mainly Chinese speaking. So I've also worked with, over the years, a whole range of organisations on a kind of very disparate range of things. I worked with the Liverpool Chinese Business Association, the Pagoda I've worked with for years. International links, for example, we worked on project a few years ago where the Chinese chess team came over and we had a Chinese chess tournament with British chess players, which was great, really, really satisfying. We have the Chinese New Year every year. A lot of the work has been, I suppose, around both supporting the Chinese community per se, but also looking at how we as a city can tap into the opportunities created by having one of the oldest Chinese communities in Europe. It's a very diverse range of activities. I think I was telling you earlier, we've just put up a plaque for sailors on the Blue Funnel Line in Chinatown, very large part from the Chinese seamen. And that was a very nice event attended by Chinese and British seamen who saw it as a very important, quite a moving event. Quite a different front. One of the organisations I work with a lot is China Wellbeing, who provide meals on wheels and support for Chinese elders in sheltered accommodation. Like most voluntary sector organisations, they've faced severe financial challenges in recent years, partly to a great extent because of cuts imposed on the council by the government. So one of the things I've done is worked with them to try and manage the impact of those cuts. And so, for example, with them, two things we've done. We've tried to provide them with free premises. We can't provide them with money, but we've helped them move out privately rented premises and move into premises provided for free. At the moment it's provided by a local developer, but we're hoping to provide them with a new purpose-built facility. But also signposting, so what I'd call one of the small coincidences of this world. Jaguar, main motor car factory on the edge of Liverpool, had 300 Chinese workers coming over summer before last and contacted one of my fellow councillors because they needed interpreters. And he asked me if I knew where to get some Chinese interpreters. Well, China Wellbeing were about to have to lay off all their staff because they'd lost their funding. So instead they went and interpreted for Jaguar for the summer and earned enough money to pay their salaries. So it's this kind of complex conversations between me and the Chinese community. A lot of it's a kind of networking function, really, I suppose.
When they, in the surgery, that's the only surgery with an interpreter, is that? In Liverpool? Is that the only surgery that has a Chinese interpreter?
Yes.
So all the other ones would be local and English language?
Yeah. It's actually the only foreign language surgery in Liverpool. So the Chinese community is the only community that's got a foreign language surgery. I don't think any of the other communities have that provision. I mean, they will have organisations that provide them with support, but it's the only councillor surgery through an interpreter. Right.
And you said it's very popular with the community. What kind of things do people come to talk to you about, their concerns? And
I'll talk partly about the surgery, but also the issues that people come to me with, because they also get referred quite a lot of casework or issues which may not come through the surgery but get referred, signposted to me by Chinese organisations, and I think that's perhaps getting to the question. Probably 2 or 3 categories. Immigration issues. Usually I'll just signpost them on to an MP, but not always, because if they've got a problem with speaking Chinese, what I'll do is actually ring an MP's office. If it's an immigration issue, an issue with the Home Office, the MP would write, but I'll draft the letter for the MP's office, getting the facts off of the Chinese person, because it saves them going through another, trying to get an interpreter elsewhere, which they wouldn't get. So that would be the commonest issue, but there might be other issues about benefits advice, a range of issues which are not local council issues or local government issues, but where I will know a man or a woman who can and can kind of signpost and ease the transition for them. So that's the first tranche of issues. Secondly, I think there are a range of issues around particularly older Chinese who don't speak English. I'm talking about different constituencies here. So one group of people will probably be younger workers who've come here, often working in restaurant or hotel trade, who are still clarifying their immigration status. There's another group of older Chinese citizens who've been living in Liverpool often for decades, but whose English is incredibly limited still. I mean, it's quite a striking feature of the Chinese community. There's some very good sheltered accommodation schemes for them, but still there can be problems. I mean, one of the particular things that is quite clear is partly because their kids have often done very well. Not a lot of them live in the city, so I'll have older Chinese people whose children live in London or Frankfurt or wherever. And of those very strong family bonds with the Chinese community, there's actually older Chinese people with very little English who don't have local family. So there will be sets of issues. Now, organisations like China Wellbeing, the Pagoda LCBA will help with that, but I'll often be a kind of also a bridge to try and help signpost services to people. So that will be the second kind of issues about older Chinese people needing help. I think the third kind of issue is what I'd call regeneration support for organisations. So organisations that are working with the Chinese community that want our support in bigger projects that I try and signpost. That's not an individual constituent issue, but it's an issue that will benefit a lot of our constituents, particularly the Chinese community.
And how long has this surgery been going on?
Can't remember really. Maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years. Not all the time I've been a councillor, but quite a long time.
And resulting from these issues people have brought up, can you think of any kind of outstanding things or memorable things that have like policy changes or outcomes because of a concern coming from the Chinese community?
I wouldn't say so much policy changes. We've only been in the administration for the last 3.5, coming on for 4 years, right? So initiatives, probably yes, whether it's around international links, trying to manage support services, really, particularly for older Chinese people. Quite a bit of the work that I'm doing now, which relates to my cabinet role, although the issues come up at the surgeries, is I suppose what I'd call building support. So we're working with the pagoda to help them. We're negotiating a community transfer, a transfer of the building from the council to the Pagoda Youth Orchestra, so they'll take over running the building. We're working with China Wellbeing to create a community asset for them. So there's a number of broadly community transfer issues that we worked on, because the organisations want their own asset, want their own facility. I mean, generally, the Chinese community is quite resilient, quite self-sufficient, and quite business-wise. I mean, so they're relatively easy to work with compared to some other community groups or minorities that I work with this account. So they're quite good at making organisations work, quite good at running businesses and buildings, which makes a community transfer and asset transfer a lot easier, frankly, than it would in some other cases.
So, talking about the community more generally, how integrated are the Chinese population in Liverpool with the rest of other communities and the more traditional Liverpoolian population?
I think you probably need to say which Chinese people, because there's actually very different groups in the local Chinese community. This is very tentative, but you might talk about 3 or 4 different groups. There are the children of, long-standing Chinese families that have been here for, 100 years or more, and who speak English perfectly well, who are kind of South End Scousers, but they're Chinese. So you've got Liverpool-born black, Liverpool-born Chinese, who are very integrated, part of the community, well-known families. That's one group, and they're completely integrated. Yeah. You've got another group of older Chinese people who probably came sometime 50s, 60s, 70s, who are often retired now. And I was talking about them earlier, and I'd say they're not that well integrated. They often don't speak English very well at all. Their kids have grown up here, and their children are integrated, but their children have often done well and moved out. And these are probably people who were predominantly, I think, working in the catering, restaurant, hotel trade. Some seamen, but often seamen would be better integrated and longer standing residents. The third group is a group of older, quite successful Chinese businesses who started off living in Chinatown but have moved out all round. So they may still have businesses in Chinatown but live all over Merseyside, and they're pretty well integrated. There'll be strong Chinese traditions, but they kind of fluent in English, and so that's a good example of that would be somebody like Grace Liu, who runs Eurochemist. Her family have got a range of business interests, is fluent in English, knows people all around the area, but also is a kind of one of the dying of picking opera, does amazing kind of tours internationally as that. So kind of strong Chinese identification, but completely integrated. The fourth or fifth group are probably, I think there's a group of younger, more, I suspect, Hong Kong born or Southern Chinese born who've moved over here in the last 20, 30 years, who I think have been quite a focus of the Pagoda and the LCBA, who was, I think, a slightly different generation, a slightly different group from the older Chinese community. Some of them are academics, some of them are business people, they're quite well integrated, but they're Chinese born, not Liverpool born. And then finally, more recently, you've got a very large wave of Chinese students, which has, transformed the mix of the Chinese community. So you see new Chinese restaurants. The traditional Chinese restaurant, frankly, in Chinatown, are, forgive me, not very good, and they really cater to the English notion of what Chinese food is. What you've had in the last few years is proper Chinese restaurants opening up, which you can see because all the people eating there are Chinese students, and it's more Sichuan menu, yeah, and in other areas. So that's the fifth group, the Chinese students, which is pretty big now. And Liverpool's promoting it. You've got top of Nelson Street, the Scandinavia Hotel is being done up by Downings, and I think that will be catering for students, but I suspect there might be quite a few Chinese students in there. So there's maybe 4 or 5 groups in the original Chinese born, older Chinese speaking, sort of immigrants who are hotel trade working, a younger wave from Hong Kong, successful entrepreneurs and younger students. That's my guess would be you might say people fall into those 5 categories, and so it's different level of integration. The second generation, the second group I talked about is probably the least integrated. The long-standing Liverpool Chinese and the newer immigrants are both better integrated in a way, I think. But I think there was a period of probably people who came here, I think, in the 50s and 60s, who aren't at all well integrated, and I think that was probably when things were most difficult for Chinese immigrants. But I wouldn't gamble on that being accurate. That's kind of a bit of a other people might say I'm talking complete nonsense in that.
And would you say that between those 4 or 5 groups, there's a degree of unity amongst themselves? Is there a sort of sense of Chineseness that transfers, or are they quite disparate?
Yes and no. When I first came here, I think it was very fractured and quite difficult. There was a real sense of different groups. My sense is in the last few years it's got a lot better. There's far less infighting and far more cooperation than there used to be. And differences about politics and geography or organisational difference seems to be much less important than they used to be, and that's really welcome. It was I found it quite difficult one time navigating my way through different camps and different factions and finding out why one group wouldn't talk to another, or it seemed quite Byzantine. I think things have really shifted a lot. I don't mean that everybody loves each other or they're all together, but I think there's been a sense of a common Chinese identity, also a Liverpool Chinese identity, and a recognition that people needed to work together. It's possible that we may be claiming too much, or it's helped a bit in the last few years, in that the new administration, Labour took over in 2010, and the then leader, now mayor, the then deputy leader, then deputy mayor, and myself, with the 3 local councillors for Chinatown, who all had quite strong links into the Chinese community. So the mayor is somebody who grew up within Chinatown, ex-seaman, knows all the Chinese community very well and is seen as that. So there's a kind of quite a layer, quite strong links between the political leadership and a lot of people in the Chinese community that probably helps, and we won't, but also that we're not going to. That we know them well enough to say, we want you to work together, not to be coming to this with kind of.
And that's Joe Anderson.
Joe Anderson, yeah.
That's good. And just on that notion of change in the 16 years, apart from the Chinese students you've mentioned and this greater unity, are there any other major changes that have happened to the community in your experience? Or significant events or shifts?
I think it's moved. I think that the balance of the community has changed from being kids of Chinese seamen and catering workers to much more business and professional. Yeah. And I haven't got the figures, but I would say that's the majority group now. The newer group are more traditional, but oddly enough, their English is better. They're actually more integrated than some of the older Chinese community. And much more students and academics perhaps, as well as businesses, you know. But also those differences are blurred a bit, I think. They'd have been very important at one time, and they're not so different now, not so important now. Which doesn't mean that, you know, people who come from a Liverpool-born Chinese family aren't really, really proud of their background and their ancestry, and other people are very conscious of where they came from. But I think that would have been much more of an issue just even 10 years ago than it is now.
And another, well, the most visible part of the community is the New Year's celebrations. And like, what role do they play in Liverpool, for the community, for the Chinese community itself, and also for the wider community?
I think it's a very popular event in Liverpool. Everybody comes down to it. Not everybody, but a lot of people do. I mean, from all over Merseyside. It's probably particularly an event for South Liverpool, not just the Chinese community, but what I'd call the broader Totsteth community. Liverpool One, where Chinatown is the kind of... There are two kind of diaspora-focused communities in Liverpool, one in the inner south and one in the inner north. The inner north is where Irish immigrants came broadly and spread out. Liverpool One, Chinatown, is where Chinese, African, Caribbean immigrants tended to come and spread out into... So you find people started off living in Liverpool 1, then they moved out to Liverpool 8, then they moved out beyond there to that. But there's a sense of... There's a degree of a sense of common identity between long-standing Liverpool-born Chinese community and Liverpool-born black community and other people from that area. I mean, an example... I moved up here in '79, and I used to drink in one of the pubs in Chinatown, the Nelson, in Upper Frederick Street. And I remember a really fierce argument in the pub one night between Eric, Ray and Roger. Roger's a white guy, he's 80 now, was a ship's engineer, Liverpool Irish. Eric, Liverpool-born black, long-standing family, Eric Caddick, and Ray Corliss, I think Guyanian in background, probably comes from Liverpool One. They were arguing about who cooked the best shumais, and that argument got quite bitter. There were two ex-seamen and one youth worker arguing about it, and it was a very distinctive part of Liverpool culture where there were men, particularly ex-seamen, these two of them were ex-seamen, arguing about cooking shumais. Now, that might not seem much today, but pretty untypical of an inner-city working-class community anywhere in the country at that time. It wouldn't have happened in North Liverpool, but it would happen in Liverpool. So Chinese food was a part of the culture of the city. I mean, it obviously became a kind of national brand, but even shumais at that time were not as wide, you know, as pervasive as they would have been. This is about 79, 80, right? So Chinese food, often I think to do with the experience of being on shipboard, you know, because New Year is about food as much as anything else. The banquet is a kind of big deal for people in the Adelphi, and it's had its ups and downs over the year. But it is quite a big event where people get together, particularly for the Chinese community, but also all the people who work with the Chinese community and identify with it. You know, it's probably not as well run as the Manchester one. I'm sure it's not, but it is quite a popular and important event for people locally.
Can I come back to what the shumai?
Yeah.
What is that?
It's a steamed Chinese dumpling. It's pork, prawn, and I'm trying to think. There's a third thing. Is it? You're laughing. It's pork, prawn, and what's the third bit? And it's food of the gods. Absolutely beautiful. SHIU stroke MAI, I think, is an English spelling of it. Try some. You haven't lived unless you've had good shumais.
Okay, and so can I ask you a bit about the history of Chinese residents in Liverpool? Just a brief summary.
And I'm not an expert on this, but I mean, originally it was a much larger community in the Chinatown area. If you look at old pictures of the area, I haven't got any to hand, but when we've been looking at kind of the regeneration of Liverpool One, you'll see that originally the streets between St James, Park Lane, Great George Street, Hope Street, Duke Street. The whole of that, there were shops along there and restaurants, and a lot of them were Chinese shops. Right. Population there shrunk. You know, I mean, the population. I mean, Liverpool was very densely populated up till about the 1950s, when there was dispersal of population, some to new towns like Kirby or Runcorn or Skelmersdale, but some just to kind of outer areas. So at one time, Liverpool 1 would have had maybe 50,000 people living there. In the 60s, 70s and 80s, that shrunk dramatically, and Chinatown shrunk as a result to really a very small group of streets. You could say almost Duke Street, Bailey Street, Berry Street and Nelson Street. Previously it covered a large area, and although that wouldn't have been a predominantly Chinese area, it would have had a very strong Chinese identity in terms of shops and businesses, and you know, a large Chinese community within that. Whereas nowadays there's probably Bailey Street, which backs off Duke Street, is completely Chinese, and I always assumed, I know some of the people there, they're all people who work in the restaurants on Nelson Street. Apart from that, the main Chinese population would be in Chung Hock House on Cathedral Park Estate, which is a sheltered accommodation predominantly for Chinese elders, and a couple of other blocks. I mean, there are other Chinese people living around there, but not in significant concentrations. That wouldn't have been the case back in the 60s, but it began to, as I said, the diaspora began of people moving out to other areas during that period. So that's a kind of, I suppose, yeah, that historic Chinatown shrank and became much less residential, and the actual business side of it shrunk, but also the residential part of it shrank. And partly, I suppose, there were new business opportunities. You know, the spread of Chinese takeaways meant that, you know, people were opening up Chinese takeaways all over. If you think about fairly recent phenomena, I mean, you're too young, God. But in the 70s, and you know, you didn't have Chinese takeaways before the 70s, and they suddenly spread out in the 70s and 80s. So I'm guessing that both existing but also new Chinese communities moved out, spread all around Merseyside. Probably around that time, and I don't know the history, but I would guess that you then get the emergence of more education and cultural services. For example, the Pagoda was established around 1979, 1980, opened in the early 80s, I can't remember the exact period. Brian Wong was the kind of the driving spirit in that, but it was funded by the City Council for years. You then had other organisations being formed. I mean, you had kind of a range of self-help organisations like the Freemasons and others, but you then had Merseyside Chinese Community Development Association, which is now China Wellbeing, which broadly caters for Chinese elders. Funding social service support for Chinese elders, which was again funded by the City Council. They were two of the biggest, probably, support organisations. The Pagoda Youth Orchestra started in, I think, the late 80s, which has been very important in terms of acting as a focus for the Chinese diaspora around Merseyside, if you like, that people come to the Pagoda, you know, their kids come, it's a way of keeping in touch with Chinese culture and history. So that's a brief bit of my background knowledge of it.
So I think we'll move to the Pierhead. So what were the sort of circumstances when and why was it proposed in this sort of this process?
If I'm very honest, I don't remember a great deal about it. I attended the event and was aware of some of the issues. If I remember right, and I confess I've refreshed my memory here as well, but I think it was the daughter of one of the people who was removed in the repatriation, who was the guiding light, supported by other SEMA and other people in the Chinese community, because there was a recognition that, you know, a really grotesque injustice was done. Several hundred local Chinese people were removed and parted from their loved ones, and people were left effectively orphaned, and it was really quite a brutal and terrible thing to do. And you know, children were left thinking their father had abandoned them when they hadn't, you know. And so I think there was a strong feeling, and once it became public knowledge, I think there was a sense that it was important to mark that, and it was something that Britain should be ashamed of. I don't think we felt ashamed locally because it was a government action, not a local action. And there was quite a strong feeling of solidarity with the Chinese community, and particularly Chinese seamen, because, there's not a lot of seamen in Liverpool now, but, a very large number of Liverpool-born families, someone in their family has been to sea and will have worked alongside Chinese seamen, and, will have felt very, very angry about that whole experience. So I think there was a very positive feeling about the memorial, that it was something we all supported, and I was pleased recently that we added to that memory of Chinese seamen in a more specific way around putting a separate plaque up in memory of the Blue Funnel Line on the building on the Chinese Nook. And Chinese and Liverpool seamen joined to pay tribute. But particularly that was also seen as a tribute to Chinese seamen in Liverpool because so many of them sailed with the Blue Funnel Line.
And do you know if there was any compensation given to the families related to that?
I don't know, honestly. I'm sorry, I'm just not well enough up on it. I wasn't involved enough in the campaign around it to add more to that, I'm afraid.
Okay. And so the community reaction was very positive.
Yeah.
From everyone.
Yeah, I think Chinese and British. Well, Liverpool's a city of the sea. It's a very strong part of its identity, and an injustice done to people who are proud of that heritage, and injustice done to seamen was something that people felt very angry about and thought it was really important to put right. If you go throughout Liverpool, you'll find nautical kind of references and people. As I said, the mayor of Liverpool's ex-seaman, would ex-seaman from Chinatown. So he was certainly something he felt strongly about,
And with the new memorial at the Nook, we'll go and visit that.
Yeah.
I hadn't heard of that. It's really interesting. Can you tell us any more about the circumstances? Because obviously we see these sort of plaques in cities, and the kind of the backstory to it, and how it gets processed through the local government is mystery. The sort of the PA, Is there anything you could tell us about this?
That was quite. It was quite straightforward, really. A group called the Sound Agents, who are based in the Nook, who are Moira and John, who I've worked with for several years, who were very interested in the oral history of Chinatown, been doing a lot of work on that, and they were very keen to commemorate that particular linkage of the building. So they had the proposal, came to me as one of the local councillors, ward councillors, but also as a cabinet member, saying, could we facilitate that and also put some money into the kitty for it? And we did it. It was pretty straightforward, really. And something we were very pleased to. And it was really nice to see so many people from the Chinese community and seamen on the day when it was put up. I'll give you the link for Moira and John to it, but I think there'll be some footage of that you could get of the people outside that, And you had people from the Chinese community and the secretary of the Seamen's Union locally speaking at it, because they wanted to commemorate the role of local seamen.
Oh, that's great. Okay, I have another question, an additional question. We mentioned Manchester in passing, but is there anything else you could say in comparison between Chinatowns in Manchester, Birmingham, London? Do you think Liverpool's Chinatown has its own...
Well, historically, Liverpool's got the oldest Chinese community, but for quite some time I think it's been quite an embarrassment and a disappointment. We've punched below our weight compared to Manchester or a lot of other cities, and we've really missed a trick. And I think that there's been a general consensus about that we've not built on our history and built on the opportunities owned by that. And the fault for that lies with both the council and the Chinese community. And I think it's been reflected neglect of that heritage and that business opportunity by the council, but also I think an inward-looking and divided sort of inward-looking attitude and divisions in the Chinese community. People were more interested in fighting over crumbs than increasing the size of the cake. And I just think that it's important to be open about that. I think things have begun to change, and I indicated earlier, I think that people in the Chinese community have begun to pull together much more in the last few years. We've got a long way to go to catch up, if I'm honest, I think, with the likes of Manchester, even certainly London. And that's really, really sad if you look at the history of the community. But I think we are beginning to open up that. Liverpool as a city has built strong links with Shanghai, and at the moment the mayor's, I think he may be back now, but he's just been over at Nice at MIPIM with Peel Holdings, who are planning a major development in North Liverpool Docks, talking to Chinese investors. We're working quite closely with businesses here and in China, promoting bilateral trade. And the other side of that is our work with Chinatown. Quite a lot of regeneration is starting to happen there, but it's still been, I think we're 10, 20 years behind other cities, if I'm honest. And then we've got a lot of catching up to do. I think it's important to be honest about it. If you look at the Chinese arch, it's a bit fur coat and no knickers, to be blunt. It's great, but there's not much behind it. And we need to embed and enrich more of the Chinese institutions, which I think we're beginning to do. I think there's an emerging consensus in the Chinese community and partners like myself in the council that we need to do that, and we can do it, but there's quite a long way to go. So I think I've been quite frank about that position. I don't want to make false claims, but I think the situation is now to be a kind of positive politician speak, but I think things have really begun to improve in the last few years, but we're going from an unnecessarily low point given our history and heritage, which is a shame, but all we can do is try and rectify the mistakes of the past.
But it must be a difficult time for that, because we've got a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
Cool. We've been talking to a lot of Chinese community centre services in London, and they're all struggling with the funding cuts at the moment. And it must be, is that something you struggle with as a council here? Because desperate situation. But it's very interesting, and actually I'm really kind of two of the organisations I've mentioned, the Pagoda Youth Orchestra on the one hand and China Wellbeing on the other, both in two ways have provided me with some of my most moving experience as a councillor. The Pagoda, most of their funding fell under myself, and the youth service budget is not statutory. A lot of the funding for that came through kind of funny money which we've lost, so we've had to make very severe savings. About 2 years ago, maybe 2.5 years ago, although we hadn't scheduled savings in the Pagoda, but we thought it was likely we were going to make cuts there. All the staff in there volunteered for voluntary severance, right, to take an enhanced redundancy payment and go. When they'd done that, we decided not to fill the posts. We were still maintaining the building, which had a significant cost to us, still cost us about 40,000. But we then had conversations with the youth orchestra and other bodies, and they said they wanted to run it on a voluntary basis. We brought in a sitting tenant. There's a nursery moved in there, a Chinese nursery, who rents some of the space. The Pagoda taken it over, and they've run it on a voluntary basis, basically. We've funded the building. What we're now negotiating, and is going to go through in the next probably month, is we're negotiating a community transfer with them. So they will take over the building with a sitting tenant with an income of about 10,000. They've also got a car park there, which sounds boring, but a car park in the city centre actually has a cash value attached. The running costs of the building are about 20,000. So probably they will get the equivalent in revenue of the cost. We'll also be doing some capital investment to make the building cheaper to run in terms of how you do that. And we'll give them a long-term asset with just a proviso that it's retained for the benefit of the Chinese community. So we've taken out, we'll have taken 150,000 out of council spending in that area,
but they've been very entrepreneurial, and they kept the service going, and in some ways it's better. Another example I sort of touched on earlier is China Wellbeing. They lost the bulk of their adult social care funding for work with Chinese elders, and we've done two things. I think I mentioned earlier, we've got them work sideways by doing interpreting work for Jaguar, which is a strange way to fund adult social care for the Chinese community, but it worked for a bit. But we're negotiating a similar community transfer with them. We've got an empty building in Chinatown, the Grenville, which was closed about a decade ago. And we're negotiating with a developer to allow the developer to take over that building and a block of land at the back and build student flats. But then within the shell of the building provide a large community space which will then let on a long-term peppercorn rent to Chinese Wellbeing. So they will get a kind of 30, 40 year lease at a peppercorn rent. That's allowed them to move out of private premises which they were renting. They'll also be able to sublet their provision. It's not come off yet. They're currently living in free accommodation provided by the developers. I think what we've negotiated in both organisations, the organisations have been tremendous in terms of being imaginative, creative, using volunteers, but also entrepreneurial. While we've got revenue cuts, we can find ways of supporting people through capital or community transfer. So it has created a real challenge, but actually I think it's been in some ways quite a positive development, and they haven't criticised it. I mean, one of the most embarrassing and kind of moving experiences I've had is the evening when China's wellbeing budget had been cut. I went to their relaunch, and people actually came up to me and hugged me and said it must be awful for me. And we just cut about 150,000 off their annual budget, and they were saying it was bad for me. I mean, it's one of the most moving things that ever happened to me as a councillor. But we have worked together really, really well, and I think that's probably. And the Chinese community have been great in recent years about that, about moving away from the inevitable choice of being grant dependent to trying to find other ways of fundraising and being very entrepreneurial. So although it's been incredibly tough, the impact of the cuts, actually it's been quite, it's almost given us a kind of stimulus to go forward in a different way. And there's a very strong partnership there between the council and the Chinese organisations to do that. It's not straightforward, you know. I mean, we kind of both give each other stick at times, but I think there is that kind of strong sense. It helps that a lot of us have worked together for quite a long time, and I think a lot of the people now who are leading some of the Chinese organisations are younger people who got impatient with what I'd call the old divisions and old camps and the rather inward-looking things. So a kind of generational change in the council and in the Chinese community has coincided with some of us knowing each other and having a slightly different way of going about things. So in the last response I gave you, I was sort of quite self-critical and about Liverpool and our Chinese community and where we'd started from. But on the other hand, I think in the most inauspicious times, we're actually doing really, really well in terms of you know, trying to work together as a community, as a city, to protect each other, and also looking at new opportunities. So although it's challenging, there are fantastic new opportunities for Liverpool and for the Chinese community in Liverpool, and the kind of what I'd call the Chinese offer in Liverpool. So it's difficult, but also very exciting.
Great. So a great future.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, I think
great history, great future.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're going to have to get away.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us.
Great.
It's been really interesting.